I remember the sound before I remember the place. It began as a faint tremor in the air, a low metallic hum that pressed against the inside of my skull, like the vibration of a tuning fork held too close to the ear. It was midnight when I first heard it, an hour when the town should have been drowned in silence. Yet, from somewhere beyond the dark hills, a church bell tolled, a slow, deliberate chime that carried through the night like a breath of cold metal. The town itself was small, more of a forgotten cluster of buildings than a community. I had been driving for hours, chasing nothing in particular, just trying to put distance between myself and the suffocating noise of the city. My headlights found the sign only by accident, a crooked wooden board leaning against a skeletal fence, its paint long stripped by wind and rain. The letters were nearly gone, but I could make out the name, Hallowford. The word looked brittle, as though it might crumble if spoken aloud. The road into Hallowford was narrow, swallowed on either side by trees that had long since stopped reaching for sunlight. Their branches twisted upward like blackened claws, their leaves a motionless tangle that muffled the sound of my tires. The deeper I drove, the more the air thickened, damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. My breath fogged against the windshield, even though the night was warm. Then the bell rang again. It was clearer this time, a sharp, resonant peal that rolled across the landscape and seemed to vibrate in my bones. I slowed the car instinctively, the sound drawing my eyes to a shape in the distance. Through the narrow break in the tree-line, I caught sight of it, a church. Its steeple rose like a black spear against the moon, crooked but still defiant. The windows were dark, no lanterns burned, yet the bell sang, deep and mournful, echoing across the valley like a cry from something buried alive. I parked at the edge of a gravel lot that looked as though no car had touched it in decades. The stones were slick with moss, and patches of grass grew tall between them, swaying in a wind I could not feel. As I stepped out, the smell hit me, a sharp metallic tang like old pennies left to rot in water. The bell gave another heavy toll, and the sound vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The church was a ruin of splintered wood and cracked stone. Its white paint had peeled away in long curling strips, revealing the gray flesh beneath. The heavy wooden doors leaned inward, one hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Ivy crawled up the walls, twisting around the windows like veins around old bone. Yet despite its decay, the structure exhaled a strange stillness, as though it were not abandoned but merely waiting. The bell above rang again. It came with the weight of centuries, deep and sonorous, and I could feel the vibration in the back of my teeth. The sound had no source. There were no lights in the tower, no ropes swaying, no movement at all. I stood beneath the steeple, craning my neck, and the moonlight glinted against something high above, a sliver of brass half hidden behind the wooden slats. It shimmered like wet metal, but there was no wind to set it moving. The air around me grew colder. My breath turned visible, curling into faint ghosts before my face. I stepped forward and pushed on the door. The wood gave way with a groan that seemed far too loud, a slow, drawn-out cry of something long asleep being disturbed. Inside, darkness pooled like ink, swallowing the light of the moon behind me. The smell inside was thick and layered, damp wood, rusted iron, the faint sweetness of mold, and beneath it all, something faintly coppery like dried blood. My shoes sank into a carpet of rotting fabric that once might have been red, but had faded to the color of old wine. Dust floated in slow spirals through the thin beams of moonlight filtering through the cracked windows. The pews sat in uneven rows, their wood warped and splintered, cushions chewed by time and insects. At the far end of the nave stood the altar, a blackened table draped in a tattered cloth that barely clung to its surface. Behind it, a massive wooden cross leaned against the wall, its shadow stretching toward me like a reaching limb. And still the bell rang. Its sound was louder inside, a suffocating resonance that filled every corner of the church. It pulsed through the floorboards, up the columns, and into my chest until I could feel my heartbeat trying to match its rhythm. My ears throbbed with each toll, and for a moment it felt less like sound and more like something alive, pressing against the inside of my skull. I tilted my head back toward the ceiling. The bell tower rose above me, a black throat of wooden beams disappearing into the darkness. A staircase spiraled upward along the wall, its railing broken in places, steps slick with dust and moss. I could see no movement above, no swinging rope or turning mechanism. And yet the bell continued, slow and deliberate, each strike separated by long stretches of silence that felt too deliberate to be random. I began to climb. The wood groaned beneath my weight, each step exhaling tiny puffs of dust that sparkled like faint stars in the moonlight. The air grew colder with each turn, heavy with the scent of rust and something older, something that smelled faintly of wet stone and ancient soil. My hand slid along the railing, its surface slick with something damp. When I looked down, my palm was streaked with a dark, sticky residue that caught the dim light like oil. Halfway up, the bell struck again. The sound was deafening, a physical force that rattled the staircase and sent a sharp ache through my jaw. My teeth vibrated like glass about to shatter. I stopped, clinging to the railing, and in that suspended moment of ringing metal, I thought I heard something beneath the chime, a low, almost human moan that lingered a second too long. The staircase ended at a narrow landing. Ahead, a door waited, its surface split by cracks and covered in a sheen of cold condensation. I pressed my ear against it. No movement, only the faint, echoing hum of the bell above. When I pushed it open, the hinges screamed, and a gust of icy air swept out, carrying with it the acrid stench of burnt metal. The bell chamber was small, little more than a wooden cage of beams and open slats that allowed moonlight to pool in cold, silver sheets. The bell itself loomed in the center, massive and ancient, its surface mottled with green corrosion. No rope hung from its mouth. No machinery turned. It simply sat, still and motionless. And yet it rang. The sound was impossibly loud here, a metallic roar that seemed to emanate from the wood, the air, even the bones inside my body. I stepped closer, drawn forward despite the ache in my ears. My breath came out in small, panicked bursts that crystallized in the freezing air. My fingertips brushed the edge of the bell. It was warm. The metal pulsed faintly beneath my skin, like the surface of something alive. The warmth spread into my hand, up my arm, and into my chest, where it settled like a second heartbeat. The bell struck again, and the vibration shot through me so violently that my knees buckled. In the ringing that followed, I heard it, not a sound, but a presence, a whisper that was not a voice, but a weight in the air. It pressed against the back of my mind, heavy and patient, as though something enormous and unseen stood just beyond the veil of perception watching. My vision blurred, the edges of the room bending inward like soft wax. Shadows stretched across the walls, writhing like fingers reaching from beneath the floorboards. I stumbled back, tearing my hand from the bell. The warmth receded instantly, leaving my skin ice cold. The shadows twitched and shivered, coiling toward the center of the room, where the bell stood like an open mouth. Another strike split the air, and the floor vibrated so violently that cracks formed in the wood beneath my feet. That was when I realized the bell was not calling outward. It was calling inward. Each toll felt like a summons, a signal meant for something buried deep beneath the church. I backed toward the door, but the staircase below had gone black, as though the night itself had risen to swallow the steps. The air thickened, and the smell of earth became overwhelming. Wet soil, freshly turned like a grave newly opened. The bell rang again. The vibration rolled through my body, and for a single heartbeat, I felt the unmistakable sensation of movement beneath the floor. Something shifting in the dark earth below, rising toward the sound. My breath caught in my throat. I forced my legs to move, stumbling down the staircase 2 steps at a time, each impact sending up clouds of choking dust. The nave of the church had changed. The moonlight that once filtered through the windows was gone, replaced by a dull, gray luminescence that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The pews were no longer empty. Dark shapes sat in rigid rows, their outlines blurred and swaying as though submerged in water. I could not see faces, only the faint glimmer of eyes, hundreds of them watching. The bell struck again, louder than ever. The shapes shuddered in unison, a slow, unnatural motion that made the air ripple. My chest tightened. My heart thrashed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I sprinted toward the doors, their wooden frames now warped and swollen, resisting my desperate pull. Behind me, the shadows shifted, rising from the pews like smoke. The bell rang once more. The door gave way with a splintering crack, and I burst into the night. The cold air struck me like a slap, and I ran without looking back, my feet slipping on the slick gravel. The sound of the bell followed me down the road, each toll slower, deeper, as though the night itself were breathing behind me. When I finally reached my car, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The church stood in perfect silence. The windows were dark. The bell tower was still. And yet, as I fumbled with the keys and started the engine, I heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A single final chime. Slow, patient, waiting. I drove until the road disappeared behind me, until the trees thinned and the night opened into the vast, empty sky. Still, long after Hallowford had vanished from sight, I could feel the vibration in my bones. Even now, when the world is quiet and the night stretches wide and endless, I sometimes hear it again. The midnight bell, calling from an empty church that should not exist. And every time it rings, it feels a little closer. The forest began swallowing the last traces of daylight long before the sun had truly set. I had taken the trail too late, thinking the soft mist rolling across the ground was nothing more than a harmless evening fog. At first, it felt almost welcoming, thin threads of pale gray drifting between the trees like quiet breath. But as I pushed deeper, the air thickened until every step forward felt like walking into a damp sheet of cloth. The path beneath me blurred. The moss-covered roots, the wet leaves, even the faint footprints I left behind began fading into a gray that had no depth. Moisture clung to my face and neck. The smell of wet earth seeped into my clothes, sweet rot, decaying bark, and the faint iron of distant rain. I remember pausing to adjust my backpack and noticing how sound behaved differently inside that haze. My own breathing echoed strangely, muffled and sharp at the same time, as though the fog itself was swallowing each exhale but amplifying every heartbeat. That was when I heard it, a single soft chime, not loud enough to mistake for anything mechanical, not metallic like a phone notification or the high ring of a bicycle bell. This was deeper, rounder, and old, like the gentle strike of a brass handbell in an empty church. One note, perfectly clear, hanging in the damp air before dissolving into silence. I froze. The fog wrapped around me like wool. No wind, no birds, no crunch of animals moving through the underbrush. Only that single memory of a sound fading from my ears. I waited, holding my breath, expecting it to repeat. Seconds stretched. My lungs began to ache. When I finally exhaled, the faintest echo returned, one hollow ring, as if answering my breath. It came from behind me. I turned, but the trail had already lost its shape. The trees stood like pale silhouettes, their trunks smeared by the fog until they looked more like distant columns of smoke than wood. There was no bell, no person, only the thick, gray curtain. I started walking again. Each step produced a wet crunch as my boots sank into the soft mulch. The dampness settled heavier in my hair. My fingertips felt slick, my palms damp even inside my pockets. I focused on the simple rhythm of moving forward, forcing my eyes to the ground so I wouldn't imagine shapes forming in the drifting mist. For a few minutes, it worked. I convinced myself the bell had been a trick of acoustics, maybe a dripping branch striking a hollow log. Then it rang again, closer, still soft, but with a clarity that cut through the fog like a thread of glass. I stopped so quickly that a small pool of water splashed beneath my boot. The sound hadn't come from behind this time. It floated from somewhere to my left, deep between the crooked silhouettes of trees where the fog swirled like stirred milk. I stood perfectly still. The damp air tasted metallic now, as though tiny flecks of rust floated against my tongue. The forest smelled sharper, too, wet pine needles and something faintly sour, like stone that had soaked in old rainwater for too long. The bell did not ring again, but I felt it waiting, as though the silence itself leaned toward me. I kept walking faster now. The trail twisted between thick ferns and fallen logs slick with moss. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. My flashlight beam looked weak and sickly, swallowed by the mist almost immediately. Each tree trunk I passed felt closer than the last, their bark damp and cold when my shoulders brushed them. Another chime. This time it followed the rhythm of my steps. One clear note after I took 3 strides, then another after 4. A pattern, steady, deliberate. Not random. Not the wind. My chest tightened until my breaths came shallow and quick. I wanted to run, but running meant losing the trail entirely. Instead, I tried to keep a steady pace, counting my steps, trying to prove to myself that the bell was only coincidence. 3 steps. Ring. 4 steps. Ring. The sound moved with me, neither ahead nor behind, always hovering at the edge of perception like a shadow seen from the corner of an eye. Each strike seemed to vibrate through the damp soil, making the soft earth beneath my boots feel faintly alive. My ears began to ache from straining, the way they do when you climb a mountain and the air pressure changes. I tried calling out once, just a sharp, nervous hello, but the fog devoured my voice. It didn't echo. It didn't even fade the way sound normally does. It simply stopped a few feet away, as though the air had thickened into a wall. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound itself. The forest began to change. I hadn't noticed at first, but the ground grew softer, spongier, as though layers of wet leaves were hiding pools of mud. The air smelled stronger, an earthy, almost sweet rot, mixed with the faint scent of cold metal. My flashlight flickered even though the batteries were new. When the beam dimmed, the fog seemed to glow faintly from within, not with light, but with a colorless luminescence like moonlight trapped in smoke. The bell rang again, and this time the sound stretched longer, the note trembling in the air until it almost became a hum. My teeth vibrated. My vision pulsed. I felt it through the bones in my arms, through the damp fabric of my clothes. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a presence. I stumbled forward, heart hammering, and nearly slipped into a shallow depression filled with stagnant water. The surface of the puddle quivered with each ring, tiny ripples spreading even when the air remained perfectly still. I stared at it and saw the reflection of something that wasn't me, something tall and impossibly thin standing far behind, blurred by the fog. Before I could focus, the surface broke into tiny bubbles, and the reflection vanished. Panic finally overpowered caution. I began to run. The forest stretched endlessly, every direction the same wet gray. Branches clawed at my sleeves and shoulders. My breath rasped loud and harsh, but the bell followed perfectly, each strike matching the rhythm of my pounding heart. It never grew closer, never fell behind. It was simply there, a constant, patient companion in the mist. At some point I tripped over a hidden root and fell hard onto the wet earth. My palms slid across slick moss. The smell of iron rushed up again, stronger now, almost metallic enough to taste. I scrambled to my feet, mud soaking into my pants, and that was when I noticed the silence. The bell had stopped. I waited, chest heaving, ears straining. Only the slow drip of water from the trees. Only the shallow hiss of fog against leaves. No chime. For a moment, relief washed over me. Then a low vibration began beneath my feet, so faint I thought it was my pulse. The ground felt alive, humming softly, a tremor that grew until I heard it not as a bell but as an endless, drawn-out note, deeper and deeper until it felt like the forest itself was breathing through me. I don't remember finding the trail again. One moment I was surrounded by the gray labyrinth of trunks and ferns. The next I was stumbling out onto the gravel parking lot where my car waited alone. The fog behind me clung to the trees, motionless and silent, as though nothing had ever happened. Yet as I opened the car door, a single chime floated across the lot. Soft, clear. It came not from the forest, but from directly behind me. I didn't look back. I don't think I ever will. There is a certain smell that only abandoned places seem to hold. Not the sharp, chemical sting of something rotten, and not quite the dry dust of forgotten attics. It's a layered odor, wet earth pressed into rusted metal, faint mold bleeding through cracked wood, and the ghost of old smoke that has settled into every surface. That smell clung to the back of my throat as I stood at the entrance to the overgrown lane, staring at the gate. The gate itself was taller than I expected. 2 iron doors, their bars curled into once ornamental shapes, now twisted by years of corrosion. Flakes of orange-brown metal littered the gravel beneath it like brittle autumn leaves. Chains looped through the center like a knotted spine, padlocked and sagging from age. Above it all hung a bell, small, simple, blackened with time. It should have been just another piece of dead metal, frozen in silence. But as the late afternoon wind slid through the skeletal trees, the bell swayed, giving off a single, dry chime. The sound was thin, almost apologetic, but it carried farther than it should have. It rang through the hollow air and touched something deep inside me. Not just the ears, something below hearing. It felt as if the vibration had reached through my ribs and pressed against the slow beat of my heart. The breeze died immediately after, leaving the woods around me in a strange, breathless pause. I hadn't meant to stop. I had been walking for hours through the old county road, following nothing more than curiosity. The locals back in town spoke of an estate hidden somewhere beyond the hills, a property that had burned decades ago and was never rebuilt. Some said the gate was still standing. Others said the gate had been torn down, swallowed by the woods. Everyone agreed on one detail. The bell on the gate still rang, though no one lived there to ring it. I approached slowly, every crunch of gravel loud against the quiet. The trees flanking the path were tall and skeletal, their bare branches scraping against one another with the dry rasp of old paper. The air smelled faintly of iron and damp moss, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes long after you leave. The closer I came, the more I noticed the texture of the ironwork, pitted like diseased skin, streaked black in places where rainwater had carved channels through decades of rust. The bell itself hung crooked, a small spiderweb bridging the gap between clapper and rim. It should have been impossible for it to ring. Another chime broke the silence. This time I watched. No wind, no movement of the gate. The bell simply shifted, as though tugged from inside, and released a low, metallic tone that spread outward in a slow wave. It wasn't the cheerful brightness of a church bell or the crisp snap of a doorbell. It was soft, almost wet, as if the metal itself was tired of making sound. The vibration ran down the bars of the gate and into the earth beneath my feet. My skin prickled with a sensation I couldn't name. Every instinct told me to turn back. But there was something in that sound, a quiet insistence, a calling that reached beyond logic. I wrapped my fingers around one of the bars. The metal was colder than stone, the rust biting into my palm like 100 tiny needles. The padlock was ancient but firm. There was no way through. Beyond the gate, a narrow drive stretched into shadow. Tall grass swallowed the path, each blade slick with evening moisture. Patches of pale gravel still gleamed between the weeds like fragments of bone. The drive curved upward and disappeared into a dense tangle of trees. Somewhere in that darkness, something shifted. Not a movement I could see, just a change in the air, a rearranging of silence that suggested presence. The bell chimed again, closer this time, though it hadn't moved. I pulled back, heart thudding. A faint taste of iron spread across my tongue, like blood. The smell of damp earth thickened, curling inside my nose until it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. I wiped my palm against my jacket and found streaks of rust and something darker, an oily residue that clung to the fabric like old grease. Dusk settled with unnerving speed. The trees around the lane lost their edges, melting into deepening shadow. The gate seemed to darken with them, the iron bars blending into a single shape that breathed with the forest. The bell became a small, hovering point of darkness, barely visible against the bruised sky. I should have left. Instead, I leaned closer, pressing my forehead against the cold metal. The silence beyond the gate was not empty. It carried weight, a low pressure that seemed to expand inside my skull. A faint hum began somewhere deep in the ground, like the vibration of distant machinery. It rose in slow increments, merging with the memory of the bell's chime until I could no longer separate sound from sensation. Then another chime, not from the gate. Behind me, I spun around. The road was empty, a narrow ribbon of pale gravel vanishing into the trees. No wind, no movement, yet the sound echoed in the hollows of the forest, rolling through the trunks like water. For a long, breathless moment I stood frozen, listening as the echo stretched and thinned, until it became indistinguishable from the faint rustling of leaves. When I turned back, the bell was swinging. It moved in slow, deliberate arcs, as though guided by an invisible hand. The clapper struck with patient rhythm, each impact slightly different from the last. The sound no longer felt like metal on metal. It carried a texture, a soft scraping beneath the ring, like nails across stone. Each chime seemed to pull the surrounding darkness a little closer. I stepped back. The gravel shifted under my heel with a dry crunch that sounded deafening in the thickening night. The motion seemed to provoke the bell. It chimed faster, its crooked arc widening until flakes of rust flung outward like sparks. I felt the vibration in my chest, in the hollows of my teeth. It was no longer a call. It was a demand. Something beyond the gate moved. Not a shape I could name, not even a clear shadow. Just a disturbance, like heat rising from asphalt, bending the air in ripples. It drifted between the trees, slow and deliberate, and with every pulse of the bell it drew nearer. The darkness behind it deepened, as though it carried night within itself. The air thickened with a smell of wet iron, sharp and sweet, until breathing felt like swallowing rust. I backed away, step by trembling step. The bell's rhythm quickened to match my heartbeat. Each chime seemed to tug at the air around me, pulling me forward even as I retreated. By the time I reached the edge of the lane, the sound had grown so loud it was no longer a tone but a roar, metal and earth and something human hidden beneath. A voice without words, pressing into the soft places of my mind. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence collapsed over the woods like a blanket. No insects, no wind. Even my own heartbeat seemed to hesitate. The gate loomed in the dim light, perfectly still. The bell hung motionless, as if it had never moved at all. I turned and ran. The road seemed longer than before, each bend stretching into the next like a corridor of endless shadow. Gravel slipped beneath my shoes, spraying into the undergrowth with sharp, brittle pops. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the gate following, or the ripple of that unseen presence sliding along the path. But the lane remained empty, swallowed by night. Only when I reached the outskirts of town did I slow. The normal sounds of the world returned in fragile pieces. Distant traffic, the soft chirp of evening insects, the faint rustle of wind through familiar trees. Yet beneath it all, buried in the quiet like a splinter, I could still hear it. A single faint chime, not loud enough for anyone else to notice, but sharp enough to follow me home. Even now, days later, the sound remains. Sometimes it drifts through my apartment at night, a thin metallic sigh that wakes me from uneasy dreams. Other times it comes in daylight, masked by the noise of passing cars, a whisper of iron just beneath the surface of ordinary life. No matter where I am, the chime finds me. It is patient. It is constant, and every time it rings, I remember the gate, the smell of rust and damp earth, and the thing that waited beyond. Still calling, still waiting, for me to answer. I don't know why I woke up that night. The clock on my nightstand glowed faintly in the dark, 2:03 a.m., its red numbers hazy through the blur of half-opened eyes. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until you start to imagine faint movements inside the walls. My breath left tiny clouds in the chill of the room, and as I pulled the blanket tighter, I heard it for the first time. A bell. Not the sharp metallic chime of an alarm clock or the delicate tinkling of a wind chime. This was deeper, older. A slow, deliberate toll, as if something heavy was being struck and left to resonate in the hollow of the night. The sound rolled across the sleeping town, muffled by distance but carried by the damp air. I froze, listening. The sound didn't belong here. The cemetery lay just beyond the cluster of pines at the far end of the road, and I knew, without question, that the ringing came from there. I had walked those grounds many times in the daylight. It was an old graveyard, hemmed in by rust-stained iron fencing, dotted with crooked headstones that leaned as if weary from holding their names for more than a century. There was no working bell, no chapel, only the small caretaker's shed and rows of earth that smelled of wet soil and forgotten flowers. Yet the bell kept ringing. Each strike seemed to linger longer than the last. The low notes spread through the fog that often drifted in from the marsh behind the cemetery. It wasn't a frantic sound. It was patient, steady, like a heartbeat. One toll, pause another. I tried to convince myself it was something ordinary, a freight train in the distance, a buoy in the river, but the tone had weight to it, a metallic gravity that made my teeth ache slightly as it passed through me. Against my better judgment, I climbed out of bed. The floorboards were icy beneath my feet. The air outside hit me with a smell I can still taste when I remember it. Damp earth, rotting leaves, and something metallic like old coins rubbed between wet fingers. Mist clung to the ground in thin bands that swirled when I moved. The world was colorless, reduced to gradients of gray and black. Even the moon hid behind a smear of clouds, offering only a faint glow that silvered the edges of the road. I followed the sound. Each step down the empty street felt louder than the last, my shoes scuffing against gravel in tiny echoes. Houses on either side were dark, their windows blank and watchful. A dog barked once from somewhere far away, then went silent, as if it too had heard the bell and decided not to interfere. The cemetery gate appeared ahead, its wrought iron twisted and rusted from decades of weather. Dew glistened along the bars like tiny eyes reflecting what little light the sky gave. The bell tolled again. The vibration seemed to seep into the metal, making the gate hum softly beneath my fingertips when I touched it. The latch gave with a reluctant creak, a sound sharp enough to slice through the fog. I stepped inside. Immediately the air changed. Colder, thicker. The smell of wet stone and turned earth filled my lungs. The mist pooled low among the graves, curling around headstones like thin, restless hands. Grass brushed against my ankles, slick with dew that clung to my skin like tiny needles of ice. Somewhere deeper inside, the bell rang again, slow, measured, and impossibly loud now, as though I stood directly beneath it. But there was no bell tower, no hanging rope, only rows of gravestones, some so worn their names were nothing more than faint scars on the rock. I walked among them, my breath trailing in pale ribbons. The sound seemed to shift as I moved, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never fixed to a single point. Each toll left a vibrating aftertaste in the air, a tremor I felt more than heard. My heart tried to match its rhythm, but the bell's patience was unnerving. Too slow to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. As I passed an especially old section of the cemetery, the ground felt different beneath my feet, softer, as if the earth had been disturbed recently. The grass there was darker, damp with a slickness that wasn't quite water. I forced myself to look down and noticed faint impressions in the soil, shallow indentations leading toward the center path. They looked like footprints, but the edges were blurred as though whoever, or whatever, made them had been standing there for a very long time. The bell rang again, closer. The sound rolled through my bones and rattled the fillings in my teeth. I could almost feel the vibration behind my eyes. I turned a corner between two leaning headstones and froze. In the center of the path stood a structure I had never seen before. A small, square frame of weathered wood, like the skeletal remains of a gazebo. From its center hung a single iron bell, dark with age, the surface mottled with streaks of rust that looked almost like dried blood in the pale light. It swayed gently, though there was no wind. The rope beneath it was frayed, the end brushing the damp ground like a pendulum searching for a hand. Each movement released another slow toll, the clapper striking the inside with a deep, resonant boom that seemed to pull the warmth from the air. I couldn't look away. Every instinct told me to run, to retreat into the safety of my home, but something deeper held me there. The bell's sound was hypnotic, each toll followed by a silence, so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped to listen. The smell around the structure was different, stronger, a mix of iron and earth, the sharp tang of old metal mingling with the damp rot of decaying leaves. It reminded me of a freshly dug grave, cold soil turned and exposed, releasing the trapped scent of things better left buried. As I watched, the rope twitched sharply, as though yanked by an invisible hand. The bell swung higher, its voice growing louder, more insistent. The mist thickened until the world beyond the small clearing disappeared entirely. I was alone with the sound, sealed in a pocket of darkness that smelled of rust and wet stone. Another toll. The ground beneath me vibrated, a subtle tremor that rose through my legs and into my chest. The headstones surrounding the clearing seemed to lean inward, their faded names catching the dim moonlight like pale scars. I stepped back. My heel sank slightly into the earth. It was softer here, unnervingly so, like standing on a sponge. The smell of iron grew stronger, metallic and sweet. My breath came out in quick, visible bursts, each one swallowed by the mist before it could fade. The bell rang again, and again. The sound became unbearable, not in volume but in presence. It wasn't just heard, it was felt, pressing into my skull, humming through my bones, rattling in the cavity of my chest. My vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing to the dark, swinging shape of the bell. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was heavy, suffocating. My ears rang in the absence, desperate to fill the void with something, anything. The mist hung motionless. Even the faint rustle of leaves had died. I don't remember running. I only remember the sudden sting of cold air on my face as I burst through the cemetery gate, the iron bars groaning in protest. The road home stretched out like a lifeline, slick with dew and scattered pine needles that stuck to my shoes as I fled. By the time I reached my house, the first pale hint of dawn was bleeding into the horizon. Birds began their tentative morning calls, fragile and hesitant, as though unsure if it was safe to speak. I locked the door, pressed my back to it, and waited. No more bells. No more vibrations. Only the ticking of the clock on my nightstand, its red numbers now showing 2:47 a.m. I told myself it had to be a dream, some strange overlap of sleep and waking. But when I finally dared to glance at my shoes, I saw the proof I didn't want. The soles were caked with damp soil, streaked with rust-colored stains that smelled faintly of iron and wet stone. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the dead of night with that same taste of metal in my mouth, the phantom echo of a bell tolling softly in the distance. And always, it's at 2 a.m. I never planned to stay in the house for more than a single winter. It was meant to be temporary, a quiet place to gather myself after a restless few years. The property sat on the edge of an old woodland in northern Maine, where the trees stretched like skeletal arms against a bruised sky, and the wind seemed to wander without direction. From the moment I arrived, the silence clung to everything, as though the world here breathed at a slower rhythm. The air carried a damp, mineral scent, like stone soaked in cold water, and every sound seemed to arrive a heartbeat late. The house itself was narrow and gray, a two-story frame with siding weathered to the color of ash. Its porch sagged slightly at the center, creaking when I stepped on the boards. At the far corner hung a single wind chime, its tubes long and thin, each one dulled by years of rain and frost. It looked unremarkable at first glance, but I noticed it the moment I pulled into the gravel driveway. The tubes were arranged in a way that felt deliberate, uneven lengths that spiraled downward like a frozen cascade. A round wooden clapper dangled from the middle, blackened as if it had been burned. The strange thing was the stillness. Though the forest beyond swayed and whispered, the chime refused to move. No matter how strong the gusts that rattled branches and tugged at my coat, the tubes remained perfectly still, as if the air around them had been sealed. During my first nights, I caught myself checking it repeatedly. Each evening, I'd glance through the kitchen window while the sky dimmed to the color of bruised iron. The woods would bend in restless waves, but the chime hung motionless, its black clapper centered and inert. It became a quiet obsession. I found myself waiting, ears straining for the faintest metallic tap, but nothing came. The silence of it was almost louder than sound. Then one night it played. It was past 2 in the morning when I woke to a faint melody threading through the house. The sound was fragile, a sequence of notes too delicate to belong to anything mechanical. It wasn't the random tinkling of metal tubes swaying in a breeze. It was a pattern, a slow, deliberate tune that seemed to circle back on itself like a lullaby played in reverse. I sat up in bed, heart drumming, and listened. The house was otherwise silent. No wind pressed against the windows. No trees groaned outside. Yet the chime sang. The melody carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy. Each note was clear and cold, vibrating with a kind of resonance that settled into the bones. I could almost feel the pitch humming along the floorboards beneath my feet when I finally stood. Moving through the hallway, I noticed how the house seemed to lean toward the sound. The walls absorbed it, as though the very structure wanted to listen. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. The knob was icy beneath my palm, as if it had been resting in deep shadow for hours. I eased it open, and a breath of night air spilled inside. Outside, the world lay in an uncanny calm. The trees stood perfectly still, their branches like black etchings against the pale glow of the moon. Not a single leaf stirred. Yet the wind chime swung gently, its tubes quivering in a motion too precise to be random. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, and for a moment the melody faltered, as if aware of me. Then it continued, shifting into a new arrangement of notes, lower, slower, almost mournful. My breath puffed white in the cold. The air smelled of wet bark and something faintly metallic, like rust bleeding into water. I stared at the chime, expecting to see some hidden mechanism, but there was nothing. The tubes floated in a soft arc, clinking together in a rhythm no breeze could dictate. I stood there until the tune ended, a final note ringing with unnatural clarity before fading into the kind of silence that presses against the ears. The chime stilled. The woods remained motionless. Slowly, the night reclaimed its ordinary quiet, leaving me with the lingering impression of something unfinished. The next morning, I inspected the chime in daylight. Its surface was rough with oxidation, streaked with faint greenish stains where moisture had pooled over the years. The clapper bore a charred texture that flaked beneath my fingers, though it left no soot. I tried moving it by hand, pushing it to one side and letting it swing. The sound it produced was disappointingly mundane, a dull, uneven clank. Nothing like the crystalline melody of the night before. Days passed without incident. Still, I found myself watching it constantly, drawn to its silent presence the way one might watch a sleeping animal, half expecting it to wake. At night, I left the curtains open in the kitchen so I could glimpse it from the hallway. Each evening, the forest exhaled a damp chill, and the smell of moss crept into the house, but the chime hung lifeless, refusing to acknowledge the restless air around it. Then the melody returned. It was a week later, again deep in the night, when the tune began. I awoke instantly, as if some part of me had been waiting. The melody was different this time, faster, almost playful, yet threaded with a dissonance that set my teeth on edge. I crept to the window and peered out. The forest was absolutely still, not a single branch stirring. Yet the chime spun in slow, deliberate circles, its tubes striking one another with impossible precision. I opened the door before I could think better of it. The air outside was sharp with frost, biting at my lungs. The porch boards felt brittle underfoot, each step producing a dry crack that seemed too loud against the music. The chime's motion was unnerving. It didn't sway with the natural rhythm of a breeze. Instead, it rotated in small, precise increments, as though following some invisible pattern. Each movement triggered a note that blended perfectly into the next, creating a tune that felt both familiar and alien. My mind strained to place it, but every time I thought I recognized the sequence, it shifted into something unrecognizable. I stayed longer than before, mesmerized by the sound. It seeped into the night, weaving between the trees and vanishing into the blackness beyond. I could almost feel it traveling, carrying itself deeper into the woods like a signal. A faint shiver crawled up my spine as I realized I wasn't alone. It wasn't a presence I could see or name, just the undeniable sense of something listening from the treeline. When the melody finally ended, I retreated inside, locking the door with trembling fingers. Sleep was impossible. The tune replayed in my head, looping endlessly, as if the chime had left an imprint on my thoughts. Even in the following days, I found myself humming fragments of it without meaning to. Each time, the notes tasted faintly of metal, leaving a coldness on my tongue. The third night it played, the melody changed again. This time it was slower than ever, drawn out like a lament. The sound carried an aching weight that pressed against my chest. Standing at the window, I saw something that turned my blood cold. Behind the chime, the forest no longer looked empty. Between the trunks, faint shapes shifted, darker patches of darkness, standing motionless yet somehow expectant. I couldn't make out faces or forms, only the sense of figures arranged in silent attention. I did not go outside. I watched from behind the thin glass as the melody stretched into the small hours, each note vibrating through the walls until I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. When it finally ceased, the shapes in the woods dissolved into the ordinary black of night, as if they had never been there. I considered removing the chime the next morning, but the thought filled me with a strange dread. The idea of touching it again, of silencing it, felt dangerous, as if it would not forgive the interruption. Instead, I began avoiding the porch altogether. I kept the curtains drawn and tried to drown out the silence with music or television, but no sound seemed strong enough to mask the memory of those notes. Weeks later, when my lease finally ended, I left before dawn without looking back. I didn't pack thoroughly. I didn't check the rooms twice. I drove until the house and the forest were nothing more than a smear of memory in the rearview mirror. Yet even now, in the quiet moments of night, I sometimes hear it again. Not outside my window, not in any physical space, but inside my own thoughts. The delicate pattern of a tune no wind could ever make. A melody that waits, patient and endless, for the next still night to begin again. I first noticed the sound late on a Sunday night, when the building was at its quietest, and the city outside felt more like a distant dream than a place of concrete and motion. The hour was deep enough that traffic had thinned to a low, pulsing hush, like the ocean breathing miles away. My apartment sat on the 8th floor, facing a narrow alley that smelled faintly of wet brick and rain even when the weather was dry. I was lying in bed with the lights off, half asleep, when it came to me, a single bell tone, impossibly soft yet sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. It was not the cheerful jingle of a doorbell, nor the hollow clang of a wind chime swaying in the night air. It sounded older, deeper, like a church bell heard from a great distance but carried inward, not outward. The note was long and round, fading with a kind of reluctant patience, as though it refused to fully disappear. I sat up in the dark, my breath clouding the space in front of me. My apartment was warm, but the sound left a chill crawling along the inside of my skin. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting for a second ring. None came. Eventually I convinced myself it was nothing, perhaps a half-dream, a scrap of imagination pulled loose from the edges of sleep. But the air in the room felt altered, dense in a way I couldn't name. When I finally lay back down, the silence no longer comforted me. It pressed in like a weight. The next night, the bell returned. I was in the living room this time, the dim glow of a single lamp painting the walls with a muted amber light. Outside, rain streaked the tall window, leaving trails like veins across the glass. The bell arrived without warning. One clean, resonant strike. It did not echo through the hall or drift from the alley. It came from inside the walls themselves, somewhere behind the plaster and wood, as though the building carried a hidden chamber that wanted to be heard. I froze. My fingertips went cold against the ceramic rim of my coffee mug. The sound had no direction. I turned my head left, then right, but it remained fixed everywhere and nowhere at once, humming through the structure. When it faded, the silence afterward felt unnatural, like a breath held too long. I pressed my ear to the wall nearest the sound. The plaster was cool and faintly gritty. I smelled paint and a trace of something metallic, as if old pipes were sweating behind the surface. Nothing moved. I tapped with my knuckle. The dull thud of solid construction met me. No hollow cavity, no loose panel. And yet the bell had been real. I could still feel its vibration lingering in the marrow of my bones. That night I slept with every light on. It did not help. Days passed. The bell grew patient, selective. Sometimes it remained silent for hours, lulling me into the fragile comfort of routine. Then, without rhythm, it would strike again, a single low toll that seemed to bloom inside my skull. It came while I cooked dinner, while I showered, while I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth. Always the same distance, as if the walls themselves were breathing it out. I began to notice small changes. The air vents exhaled a faint, cold draft that smelled faintly of wet stone. The wooden floorboards, usually dry and clean, sometimes felt damp beneath my bare feet, slick as though a fine mist had seeped through unseen cracks. In the quietest moments, I thought I heard a second sound beneath the bell, an almost inaudible shiver, like the rattle of thin chains dragged across concrete. Neighbors offered no comfort. I never heard anyone in the hallway. The apartment above mine stayed empty, its door sealed with dust around the hinges. The unit below belonged to an elderly man I'd never met. Even during the day, the building felt deserted, as if all life had retreated behind heavy curtains. My mailbox remained empty for weeks. When I passed the lobby mirror, my reflection looked washed out, too pale against the dim light. One evening, around 2 in the morning, the bell woke me with unusual force. It was louder, sharper, almost urgent. I rose from bed and followed it through the apartment. The sound seemed to shift as I moved, drawing me from room to room without ever becoming clearer. I traced it to the narrow hallway that connected the bedroom to the living room. There, the wallpaper, an old pattern of faded blue leaves, was slightly damp beneath my palm. I pressed my ear to the wall again. Behind it, something moved. It was not a human sound. It was slow, deliberate, like a deep breath drawn through stone lungs. The bell struck once more, so close it felt as though the metal were pressed directly to the back of my skull. The vibration passed through me, rattling my teeth, and for a brief instant I tasted iron on my tongue. The next morning, I noticed a thin crack running along the seam where the hallway wall met the ceiling. It wasn't large, no more than the width of a hair, but it followed the entire length of the hallway like a drawn line. From the crack seeped a faint scent of rust and earth, the smell of wet soil left to rot in darkness. I tried to ignore it. I left the apartment for long hours, walking aimlessly through the city, lingering in coffee shops and crowded train stations. But the sound followed me in memory, a phantom tone that clung to the edges of my hearing. At night, the bell welcomed me back before I even unlocked the door. One deep note waiting. Sleep grew impossible. My thoughts slowed, heavy and sluggish, as though the air inside the apartment contained something thick enough to dull the blood. Sometimes I would wake without remembering having fallen asleep at all, standing in the hallway with my hand on the wall, the crack above me wider than before. The final night began with rain. The alley outside was slick and black, the streetlights casting long streaks of pale orange across the wet bricks. Inside, the apartment smelled strongly of iron and damp plaster. I sat in the living room with every lamp burning, but the light felt weak, as if swallowed by a deeper shadow that clung to the corners. The bell struck again. It was no longer distant. It rang inside my skull, vibrating through my chest, shaking the air until the floor beneath me seemed to ripple like disturbed water. I covered my ears, but the sound lived within me, not outside. The crack in the hallway ceiling split with a faint, tearing sigh. A droplet of dark water fell and burst against the floor, leaving a stain that spread in the shape of a small circle. Another strike followed, deeper, slower, almost human in its measured patience. I stepped into the hallway, each board groaning underfoot as though protesting my weight. The air was cold enough to bite. The walls pulsed faintly, a rhythm in time with the bell. The crack widened before my eyes, small flakes of plaster dropping like ash. From the darkness within came a smell of wet earth and rusted metal, thick enough to taste. The bell rang again, and the light bulbs overhead flickered, dimmed, and finally died. In the darkness, the wall shuddered. Something behind it shifted forward with the sound of stone sliding over stone. I could feel it leaning closer, pressing against the thin barrier of plaster, breathing in slow, heavy intervals. The bell rang one final time, so deep and resonant that the vibration traveled through my bones and into the floor beneath me. And then silence. I stood there, blind in the dark, heart hammering against my ribs. The smell of rust and soil filled my lungs until I felt I might choke. I reached out with a trembling hand, fingers brushing the damp wallpaper. It was warm. I don't remember moving after that. Somehow I woke hours later on the living room floor, my body aching, the lamps still dead. The hallway was silent. The crack had sealed itself, leaving only a faint discoloration where the plaster had once split. But when I pressed my ear to the wall, the faintest echo lingered. One distant note, trembling just beneath the surface, as if waiting for the next time I would dare to listen. I left the apartment that morning with nothing but the clothes on my back. I did not lock the door. I did not look behind me. And still, even now, when the night grows heavy and the city grows quiet, I sometimes hear it. A distant bell, echoing in walls that are no longer mine, calling through every place I try to hide. I had always been drawn to forgotten places. There's a gravity to them, a pull that feels less like curiosity and more like a quiet demand. When I first heard about the old Hawthorne Elementary, an abandoned school that had been sealed for nearly 40 years, I knew I would eventually find my way there. People in town only ever mentioned it in passing, as if saying the name aloud was enough to conjure something they preferred to keep buried. The few stories I caught were fractured, vague whispers of a sudden closure, unexplained accidents, and a bell that once called children to class but hadn't rung since the last day the doors were locked. It was late autumn when I finally went. The evening air was sharp enough to taste, and a thin veil of mist clung to the streets like damp breath. The school sat on the far end of an overgrown road, hidden behind a sagging chain-link fence that did little to keep anyone out. As I approached, the smell of rust and wet leaves thickened in the cold air. I stepped over the bent metal, my boots sinking into a carpet of decaying foliage that gave off a deep, earthy odor. The school loomed ahead, 3 stories of crumbling brick streaked with black mildew, windows punched out like missing teeth, and the faint metallic outline of a bell tower rising crookedly against the gray sky. Every sound carried unnaturally in that stillness. My own footsteps echoed back at me, muted but persistent, as though someone were walking in time just a few paces behind. The closer I drew, the more I felt the weight of the building pressing outward, as if the emptiness inside wanted to spill into the world. The front doors were swollen with moisture and hung slightly ajar, their once bright blue paint blistered into scaly flakes. When I pushed them open, a stale gust of air rolled out, cold and dry, with the unmistakable scent of chalk dust and old paper that had been left to rot. Inside, the silence was almost physical. My flashlight beam sliced through a haze of fine particles that hung in the air like suspended ash. The hallway stretched forward in a perfect, oppressive symmetry. Lockers lined the walls on both sides, their doors warped and rusted, some gaping open to reveal tattered textbooks and broken pencils that looked frozen in mid-abandonment. The floor was slick with moisture, and the faint imprint of old footprints marred the layer of dust as though someone, or something, had walked here long after the school had died. I moved slowly, each step releasing the faint groan of warped tiles beneath my weight. The smell of mold was stronger here, layered with something sour and faintly metallic that clung to the back of my throat. My flashlight passed over faded murals of smiling children, their painted faces peeling into twisted grins. A water-stained clock above a classroom door still displayed the time, 3:15, as if the batteries had only just died yesterday, though the school had been empty for decades. The bell tower was my destination. I had read about it in old newspapers. A proud brass bell that once signaled the start of every school day, said to be so loud it could be heard across the entire valley. According to town records, it was supposed to have been removed years ago for safety, but no one ever came to claim it. Local legend claimed the bell remained silent from the day the school closed, its voice lost to rust and time. Yet, there were murmurs of people who claimed to have heard it tolling on windless nights. One heavy, solitary ring that cut through the dark. I found the stairwell at the end of the hallway. The door resisted at first, then surrendered with a groan that vibrated through the metal frame. The air inside the stairwell was colder, damp enough to carry the faint smell of standing water. I began to climb, each step coated in a slick film of moss that made the iron rails clammy beneath my grip. Higher and higher I went, past cracked windows that framed the night sky in jagged black. The wind outside was dead still, yet I could hear faint creaks above me, like weight shifting against old beams. When I reached the third floor, the hallway opened into a wide landing beneath the bell tower. The walls here were darker, scarred by decades of water damage. A single wooden door stood at the base of the tower, its paint eaten away until only raw splinters remained. As I approached, I noticed something peculiar. A trail of dry leaves scattered in a crooked path that led straight to the door, though every window around me was sealed tight. I stepped carefully, feeling the brittle crunch beneath my boots as I reached for the iron handle. The door opened with surprising ease, swinging inward on a gust of air that smelled of cold iron and rain. The tower was a narrow cylinder of wooden beams and spiraling stairs that climbed into darkness. My flashlight beam wavered across the rough stone walls, illuminating the nests of birds long gone and the streaks of rust that bled from iron bolts. The climb was slow and uneven. Each step moaned under my weight, the sound swallowed quickly by the void above. The higher I went, the more I sensed the air changing, growing heavier, denser, carrying a faint hum that was more vibration than sound. It was as if the wood itself was holding its breath. At the top, I emerged into the bell chamber. The space was small and circular, open to the night through broken shutters. Moonlight pooled across the floor in thin silver streams, revealing decades of dust stirred into faint patterns by unseen drafts. And there it was, the bell. Immense and blackened with age, it hung suspended from a rotting wooden beam, its surface mottled with streaks of green corrosion. The rope that once connected it to the ground was still there, frayed and brittle, coiled loosely like a sleeping snake. I stepped closer. The smell of old metal was overwhelming, sharp and bitter, mixed with the faint scent of dried bird droppings and wet stone. My flashlight caught the edge of the bell's mouth, where faint etchings of letters, long illegible, were barely visible beneath layers of tarnish. The silence here was not merely absence of sound. It was active, a thick, pressing quiet that seemed to listen. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, each thump answering the strange hum in the air. Then it happened. A sound, soft at first, like the faintest brush of metal on metal, rolled through the chamber. I froze. The bell, motionless in the moonlight, quivered almost imperceptibly. A low vibration crawled through the floorboards beneath my boots, subtle but undeniable, followed by a single, resonant strike. Bong. The note was deep and wet with age, a sound that felt less heard than absorbed into the body. It rang out with a force that shivered the air, rattling the shutters and sending a cascade of dust spiraling from the rafters. I staggered back, my flashlight beam jittering wildly across the walls. The bell swung slightly, just enough to catch the light along its corroded lip. There was no wind, no rope pulled, nothing that could have set it in motion. Bong. Another strike, louder this time, vibrating through my chest and into the marrow of my bones. I could taste the metal in the back of my throat, bitter and electric. The air around me seemed to compress, the pressure building until every breath felt like dragging glass into my lungs. The rope twitched, a slow, deliberate motion, as if being pulled by a hand I could not see. Bong. The third toll shook the entire tower. Boards groaned. A rain of fine powder fell from the ceiling like ash. Somewhere below, a door slammed with a force that echoed up the stairwell. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, and went out, leaving only the cold glow of moonlight and the black silhouette of the bell. I don't remember deciding to run. My body moved before my mind could catch up, feet hammering against the trembling stairs as the sound followed me. Another strike, and another, each one impossibly loud, impossibly close, as though the bell were chasing me down the spiral. The vibrations climbed the railings, shuddering through my hands and into my teeth. Dust filled my lungs, the taste of iron coating my tongue until I felt I might choke. When I burst back into the hallway, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was not relief. It was a hollow, ringing emptiness, like the air itself was holding the echo. I staggered down the stairs, barely keeping my footing on the slick tiles, my flashlight sputtering back to life just long enough to reveal the hallway ahead. The murals of children seemed different now, their peeling eyes glistening wetly in the dim light. Outside, the night was unchanged, still cold and different. The mist clung low to the ground, swallowing the path back to the fence. Behind me, the school stood silent and dark, the bell tower etched against the moon. I waited, breathless, half expecting to hear another strike cut through the quiet. But there was nothing. Only as I reached my car did I realize the sound in my ears hadn't faded. It was faint, distant, but undeniably there, a deep, lingering vibration like a memory of thunder. Even now, as I write this, I can still feel it resonating deep inside me, an echo that no silence can smother. The bell of Hawthorne Elementary rang after decades of silence. And somehow, I don't think it stopped with me. It began as a sound so faint I thought it belonged to a dream. A thin chime, distant and deliberate, threading itself through the heavy stillness of my apartment like a silver needle pulling at frayed fabric. At first, I wasn't even sure it was real. The night was thick with the kind of quiet that makes the air feel padded, muffled, as if the walls themselves were absorbing every breath. But there it was again, soft, metallic, impossibly clear. A bell. I lay on my couch, the lights off except for the jaundiced glow of a street lamp bleeding through the blinds. The air was stale with the scent of old carpet and dust, carrying a faint undertone of cold iron from the radiator. The building around me, an aging complex of cracked plaster and hollow walls, usually hummed with its own nocturnal life. The low sigh of pipes, the whisper of wind along the window seams, the faint scurry of something unseen in the ceiling. But tonight those familiar noises seemed to hold their breath, making space for that single, repeating chime. It wasn't like the shrill electronic buzz of a doorbell, nor the cheerful trill of a phone notification. It was older, purer. The sound of an actual bell, small but resonant, as though a piece of polished brass was being struck with something soft and deliberate. Each ring was separated by a pause that felt too intentional to be accidental, as if whoever, or whatever, was ringing it was waiting for a response. I pushed myself upright, the couch springs creaking like brittle bones beneath me. The air felt colder as I moved, the kind of cold that carries a damp weight, clinging to the back of the throat. I checked the window first, peeling the blinds apart with trembling fingers. The parking lot outside lay under a wet sheen of moonlight, empty except for the crooked silhouettes of abandoned shopping carts. No movement, no source. The bell rang again, closer now. Not loud, but near enough that it vibrated through the wooden floorboards beneath my feet, a subtle tremor that traveled up through my legs and into my chest. It didn't come from the hallway, nor from the stairwell where sound usually echoed. It felt internal, as if the walls themselves were carrying the chime. I stepped into the narrow corridor that connected the living room to the rest of the apartment. The carpet here smelled faintly of damp concrete and the bitter, metallic tang of rusted nails. The darkness was layered, deep enough that each step forward felt like pressing into a substance rather than air. The bell rang again, and I felt it inside my skull this time, a vibration against the bones behind my ears. Not deafening, just present. Every apartment door along the hallway remained closed, their brass numbers dull in the dim light. No shadow moved beneath any threshold. No neighbor stirred. I strained to hear something else, footsteps, a breath, a shuffle, but the bell was the only sound. And it was waiting. I thought of calling someone, but the idea of speaking into the silence felt wrong, as if naming the sound would grant it more power. Instead, I followed it, though there was no clear direction. It didn't guide me toward the entrance, or the windows, or the kitchen. The chime seemed to bloom from everywhere, yet always just ahead of me, receding like a phantom footstep. When I reached the bathroom door, the air shifted. It was a subtle but undeniable change. The temperature dropped by several degrees, and a thin film of moisture gathered across the mirror's surface, even though the room hadn't been used in hours. The bell rang again, sharper now, like a blade of sound slicing through the damp air. I placed my hand on the door. It was cold enough to sting. I opened it slowly. The light flickered once before stabilizing, casting a pale, almost underwater glow across the cracked tiles. The sink was dry, the tub empty, but the bell, it was inside, not visually but in essence. The sound pressed against my chest from every angle, vibrating the medicine cabinet's thin metal frame until it rattled against the wall. I felt it in my teeth. The mirror was fogging despite the cold. Not evenly, patches of mist formed in erratic shapes, like breath drawn by invisible lungs. And there, faint and shimmering, I thought I saw a silhouette forming within the haze. Not a reflection of myself, but something standing behind the glass, deeper than the surface would allow. A tall outline, featureless except for the faint glint of something metallic at its side. A bell dangling from a thin cord. The ringing intensified, not louder but denser. It filled my ears, my throat, the hollows of my bones. Each chime came faster, eroding the spaces between them until the sound became a single, endless vibration that made the bathroom walls appear to breathe in and out. I staggered back, but there was nowhere to go. The door behind me seemed farther away than it should have been, stretched by some impossible geometry. Instinct, primitive and absolute, told me what it wanted. It wanted me to answer, not with words, but with action. A physical acknowledgement. A yes. My hand moved without my consent, lifting toward the mirror. The surface pulsed faintly beneath the fog, a heartbeat of cold light. The bell's rhythm slowed as my fingertips hovered an inch away, the sound elongating into deep, aching tolls that resonated like a funeral knell. I pressed my palm flat against the glass. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed was not relief. It was a vacuum, dense and alive, sucking the warmth from my skin and the breath from my lungs. The mirror's surface felt soft, too soft, like the thin membrane of something alive. And beneath it, I felt the faintest answering pressure. A palm, matching mine. I yanked my hand back and stumbled into the hallway. The air outside the bathroom was warmer, but only slightly. The faint smell of metal clung to my fingers, sharp and bitter, like the residue of blood left too long in the open air. I waited, frozen, for the bell to return. It didn't. But silence offers no comfort when you know it is conditional. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time bent in that heavy stillness, and still no sound came. Eventually, I collapsed onto the couch again, exhaustion overriding fear. My eyelids burned with grit and cold. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and filled with strange, echoing dreams. I woke to a room steeped in gray morning light. The building had resumed its normal chorus of creaks and distant plumbing. For a moment I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. But when I went to the bathroom, the mirror still bore the faint outline of a handprint, larger than mine, etched into the fog that had long since dried. And on the edge of the sink, resting where no one could have placed it without my knowing, lay a small brass bell. Its surface was cold and perfectly still, yet I swear I could feel it waiting. Not to be rung, but to be answered again. Every night since, the silence feels thinner, stretched like skin over something that breathes beneath. I know the bell is patient, and I know, with a certainty that gnaws at me in the small hours of the morning, that it will ring again the moment I dare to forget.